Hi everybody, I'm Michael Davis. Welcome to Bone2Pick. I am totally stoked today to have the opportunity to sit down with our Artist of the Month for December, one of the most brilliant trumpet players anywhere in the world today, the great Chris Gekker. Chris is originally from the Washington, D.C. area. He is a graduate of the Eastman School of Music and received the coveted Performer Certificate while at Eastman. He's been a member of the American Brass Quintet, started in 1981, was with them for 18 years. Also principal trumpet of the Orchestra of St. Luke's, performed extensively with the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, and he has been described as the most recorded trumpet player in the chamber music medium. He has been guest principal trumpet with the New York Philharmonic and San Francisco Symphony. He is an esteemed author. He's one of the most sought-after teachers anywhere in the world. He's held the Professor of Trumpet position at the University of Maryland since 1998. He's also, and I can attest to this firsthand, he's one of the most versatile trumpet players you're going to find. He's also performed extensively and recorded with Sting, Billy Joel, Peter Gabriel, Wayne Shorter, as well as numerous motion picture soundtracks. He's done virtually everything you could do in the world of trumpet performance. He's been heralded by the New York Times, CD Review, and Gramophone magazine for his virtuosic trumpet playing. So we are really honored to have him here today. We are coming to you from New Jersey City University. And Chris, thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule. I know you've got a master class in performance this afternoon, so we really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to talk to you, as always.
Thank you, Chris. Well, let's jump in and talk about maybe your formative years. I know you were born in D.C. and grew up in Virginia, but certainly associated with the D.C. area. And I was curious, just what kind of led you to the trumpet early on?
Well, most public school kids, probably all of us have this in common. Fourth grade, they bring all the instruments around. And I picked trumpet. I had heard it at a few concerts. You grow up in D.C., you end up hearing a lot of military bands. And there was a lot of trumpet on TV. I remember sitting watching TV with my parents, watching the Jackie Gleason show. You'd hear Bobby Hackett, and,
right.
And he'd have guests like Dizzy Gillespie. I remember Louis Armstrong once on there. So, and then there was the Herb Alpert years and so on. So I picked the trumpet. I had great band directors, two in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right outside of D.C., Jack Dallinger and Roy Smith, both great trumpet players, so I got to hear that in school. We would go, back in those days, there was no Watergate Hotel. Watergate meant a series of steps by the Potomac River, and the military bands would play on a floating barge, so I grew up doing that. My parents are both European. My mother was from Dusseldorf, Germany. My father was Russian background, though he grew up in New York City during the Depression. There's a lot of music in the house, and of course there it was like Schubert, Schumann. My father was a very fine amateur pianist who played beautifully, and so I would hear that in the house. Once you got outside the door, you're talking about the 60s, it was the time to be in bands. I mean, every kid who played an instrument, and what we called soul bands back in those days. We'd play Wilson Pickett, James Brown. I got very used to playing in bands where no one read music, which was great training. On Saturdays, everyone around a record player, and you just pick out the parts you need to play. And got started hearing other things. I remember when Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experiencing? We didn't know what to make of this record. We went nuts over that. And then the early Chicago Transit Authority, we're just listening. And so I had that dual sort of Euro inside the house, and then started listening to jazz. And I remember my parents were always so supportive. I mean, really, and they didn't really, they knew I liked jazz, and so they bought a Miles Davis record. I was a sophomore in high school, and they bought Field of Kilimanjaro, which was the last quintet record, Wayne Shorter, right before In a Silent Way. And I remember them putting it on. It was like this kind of wind from another world. I mean, everyone was sort of quiet, and we were all sort of bewildered. Well, I couldn't stop listening to it. And I think that for a kid that age, you hear Miles and Wayne Shorter, nothing's ever going to be the same after that. And so yeah, but it was always that duo thing. My father would take me back in those days. Ormady would bring the Philadelphia Orchestra to Constitution Hall, and I was very aware of Gil Johnson, the first trumpet. I absolutely raked through the local public library. The New York Philharmonic recorded Mahler III with Johnny Ware playing the postman. So for trumpet players of my generation, you can talk to Vince Penzarella and Phil Smith and so many people. That was sort of this iconic recording. Johnny Ware played so expressively. And of course, Bernstein, set this atmosphere up. So that one record seems to be like a kind of a coming of age experience for all of us, and so that was a big deal. And then so I grew up in high school playing I was playing orchestra and solos, and then also playing jazz and rock, and in what we nowadays we call a funk band. Back then we called soul bands. And then when I was looking to go to college, I wanted to go to a college that had both, and it didn't exist too much back then.
Right.
There were some big music schools in the country that would expel you if you were practicing jazz. So I thought back then it was Indiana with David Baker and Eastman, which we associate with Chuck Mangione. He wasn't quite there yet, but he had sort of started that thing.
Right.
And so I went to Indiana, and I had a great time playing for Mr. Davidson and Phil Farkas and all, but I noticed there that it was separate. Now, I couldn't afford to go all the way to Rochester, but just talking to people, there was a lot of Eastman nights in the D.C. area because the military bands have always been filled with, and I knew that it was mixed, so I wanted to go to Eastman.
Yeah, that's
and
great.
It was the best possible choice. I had a kind of a teacher in high school that, when he found out I was listening to Miles Davis, almost wouldn't speak to me, and it was a subversive act in those days in a lot of areas. So, but that experience at Eastman, where you would play in an orchestra and brass quintet, and then Ray Wright, and back then there was a lot of big band gigs to have around Rochester, weddings, club dates, and you'd play late on a Friday night, and then Ray Wright would have studio orchestra 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, and you couldn't be late. And that discipline he taught, because he had just come from Radio City Music Hall to Eastman, and it was that sort of ethic of, like, you show up on time even if you just got 3 hours of sleep, and I don't care how you feel, you're going to play. And by the way, he was a great guy. I mean, but he taught
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
professional ethic,
I got a lot of that myself, and in my day it was jazz ensemble met at 9 o'clock in the morning on
yeah.
Saturday, so it's the exact same kind of.
That is true. And then he started the studio orchestra, which would be, he'd have the jazz ensemble, he'd add strings. So it was
That was such a great thing that he started too. That was
Yeah.
a really cool thing that we would go, as you did yourself. Well, Chris, that's some great stuff, and I think what's really interesting, and just the way you described your upbringing, that really attests to your versatility. I mean, you're just very versatile. I think I wanted to talk a little bit more about your experience at Eastman. I know it's rare, but a few of the brass players did receive the Performance Certificate, which is a very coveted, very prestigious award. You were also a member of the faculty quintet, the Eastman Brass Quintet, along with Alan Vizzuti, and I know Alan was a fellow student at the same time. Maybe you could talk a little bit about those years specifically with those couple of things.
Well, Alan was a couple years ahead of me, and I feel the same way now at Maryland or at any school I taught at Juilliard for like 12 years, and I think that the best school atmosphere is when you have strong teaching, but within the studio you have a sort of a big brother, big sister relationship between the older students and the younger ones. It's very, very important to have that dynamic. Just like a sports team, you need sort of leaders on the field. Mm-hmm. And at Eastman, Alan was like that. He was just like so, playing-wise, he's just sort of kind of like off the charts, But he was always a very giving, generous person with advice and just leading by examples. We would do gigs. I remember we toured with the Temptations, and we'd do other things. And we played in the Rochester Philharmonic a lot together. Toward the end, by the time I was a senior, he was too busy. He was in grad school. He was just too busy already playing so many solos. And Rochester Philharmonic had 2 full-time trumpet players, Dick Jones and Abe Lillard, and they would always hire a third. So I was with the regular there, so playing every week with them, basically. And Alan, and there were others, and Vinnie DiMartino, who had been at school a little before, but was coming back. Back in those days, Eastman Kodak would have an industrial show.
Sure, yeah.
And so Vinnie would come back for that, and he and I would do that gig, and it just, it was just a great atmosphere for learning. Tough, conductors like Donald Hunsberger, I remember when we were all sitting there as freshmen, and he gave a speech, and he said, the main thing I want you to know is the next 4 years will be the most protected years of your life. And we're like what? But he taught great lessons. I mean, he was a great leader, and sort of tough love, which is what you need. It's a tough business.
Yeah.
But you need nurturing, so you need the two things side by side. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump ahead now. Your first, I mean, you were already working as you described in Rochester, but I guess your first, kind of big landing point as a professional was in Kansas City with the Philharmonic there. What was that like in getting that position?
Well, I took the job. I took the audition. It was a big one. There was a lot of people there. At Kansas City Philharmonic was they had most of the summer off, but it was a very active orchestra with recordings, Carnegie concerts, and it's kind of a funny story. I mean, I just graduated from Eastman. I just wasn't really sure. I had an invitation to come back and stay in the quintet and in the Philharmonic, and I was thinking that I'd probably head back to Rochester after the summer. And so I went out for the audition. And it's kind of a funny story, but I grew up in D.C., and back in those days, we just had National Airport, which is right in Alexandria. And I kind of just thought that that's the way airports were, that when you land at airport, you were in town. So I fly to Kansas City, and I jump in a cab. 30 minutes later, I'm still looking at these fields. We're still... And by the time it got to Kansas City, it was all the money I had to get. And keep in mind, I mean, many people might be watching this, that there was a time when there were no ATMs, no cell phones, no answering machines. So I had cash in my pocket and no way to get other cash. So I show up there, and there were 60 or 70 people there. A lot of Chicago, a lot of guys going for this job. And Kansas City had a rich tradition. I mean, Dale Clevenger had been first horn there, Phil Farkas before him, Charlie Schluter had been first trumpet.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Oh, yeah. It was in the days when orchestras like Kansas City and New Orleans almost acted sort of like as AAA teams, and Guitarra came to Boston from one of those kind of orchestras. And, so, and it was a good job. I mean, it was anyway, they picked, I think, 12 people to play the next day, and I'm in downtown Kansas City. I find basically a flop house for like $2, and I basically slept. It's laid in that cot with all my clothes on, with my trumpets in my arms. And the next day, you didn't really have money to eat. I mean, I don't mind. It's not. I was young, and you don't care when you're young. So that next day we went from 10 to 6 to 4 to 2, and then at the end of the day, they looked at me and said, "We'd like to offer you the job." And I remember Vince Bilardo was the personnel manager, and he said, "Now, do you have any questions?" And I said, "Yeah, can I borrow $20 to get?" I mean, he just cracked up. I told him later, I would have really, I guess I would have had to borrow money even if I'd not won, because, just on the honor system. And he said, "Yeah, I would have spotted you, kid. You're okay." But it was an awkward situation.
Well, now we've discovered the keys to orchestral auditioning. In addition to playing great, stay at a flop house the night before the finals.
Well, I do tell my students sometimes that there's a window, and for me it was in my early 20s. There's a window when you practice that way, you hammer out those extras. I think later on, I mean, wasn't taking any after that, but I also don't think I could have. I mean, I think a lot of my students would have beat me. There's a way you practice when you're getting excerpts ready, and then there's a way you play when you're actually in the orchestra playing those pieces.
Yeah,
and it's a lot of difference.
Sure.
So it's hard if you're doing the job. I mean, my last teacher, Gerard Schwartz, who I'd like to speak about if that subject comes up, because he was a gigantic influence. He used to say there's performing, recording, and auditioning. And it's like 3 different ways of playing, and he says it's rare to find someone who is equally good in both. Some of the best trumpet players I've ever met in my life have never won an audition. I know people who've won several auditions who wouldn't be my first choice. And then I knew people that were deadly in the recording studio, but almost had stage fright, and vice versa. Guys that you'd play with and terrific, and then they would tighten up in a recording studio. So it's a
well said. Yeah, I never thought of it like that, but you're absolutely right. It's kind of those 3 components. Yeah. Well, let's jump ahead to New York. I mean, you're so associated with the incredible amount of work, and in preparing for this interview, I knew so much about your career and what you've done, but looking at your resume, it's just beyond impressive. But if you could address there's 3 things that really jump out. Of course, your time with the American Brass Quintet, very important, and one of the great brass quintets anywhere in the world. And then, of course, your time, which was kind of concurrent with being principal trumpet in Orchestra of St. Luke's. And also, maybe if you could touch on the performances you did with the Orpheus as well.
Well, Ray Mace called me to audition for the American Brass Quintet in 1981. I had left Kansas City in '79. I'd moved back to D.C. I was getting doing some graduate work at the University of Maryland. They had a faculty brass quintet I was playing with. And I was also doing a lot of shows. There were in the theaters in town, Warner, Ford's Theater, National Theater. There was this constant, I was just always playing a show or at the Kennedy Center. But when the call came from Ray, I was doing the Bernstein Mass at the Kennedy Center. And this is also in the days before answering machines. You know, Ray had talked to someone in Canadian brass who's, you know, they had actually picked somebody, I think from LA, I'm not quite sure, but this guy said, you know, there's someone else you might want to just check out if you have the time. And Ray said, yeah, sure. So, and he had to call, and he thought, like, call my mom, and my mom knew a number I might be reached at. And this is the way it was in the old days, you know, like the old Chinese China song near the music union. You know, people, anyway, so I arranged to go up and offered me a job. And for the first year, I spent most of my time still in D.C. I just had too many work to do, but I went up to New York and would play the quintet stuff. They had a recital series at Carnegie Recital Hall and some tours, and then Aspen in the summer. And then, but anyway, I got asked by St. Luke's and I did a tour with them with the Vienna Choir Boys, and then they offered me the spot, and Ray and I sort of functioned as co-principals with Orpheus. In those days, Orpheus did not designate trumpeters as members. They do now. And my dear friend Carl Albach, who played second to me for years in St. Luke's, does that work with Orpheus now. And Carl's a great friend and great player. But anyway, Ray and I would sort of act as co-principals with Orpheus. So Orpheus had signed a big recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon. I mean, multiple CDs, and St. Luke's was doing lots of recording as well. It's a very active time. We were doing so, and it was like if they worked together. So if I put the quintet schedule with Orpheus and St. Luke's, it sort of meshed, and it was almost a year. You know, it was almost filled your year. And on top of that, I would do studio work and the occasional bits with the Philharmonic, and I started working, you know, fairly frequently with the Chamber Society of Lincoln Center, and so it was great. I mean, it was, you know, New York can be this unbelievable mix of experiences, and it's a wonderful place. And I always tell my students, and I've told my own kids who are musicians, you know, if you're young and you have enough money to be, you know, not too worried, there's no greater place in the world to be than New York City. I mean, it's just the hang and the you know, just the variety of what's going on. It's just incredible. So many creative people. It's just great.
So vibrant.
And there are creative people everywhere. In Kansas City there were, in D.C. there are, but New York is just a special place.
Yeah. You know, you were saying before the interview, and I wanted to touch on it specifically about St. Luke's, that was kind of the hipster orchestra. And you guys, I mentioned the Lyle Mays Street Dreams project, one of my favorite CDs, and that the orchestra, and you were featured prominently on it. But maybe talk a little bit about you mentioned some of the cool things you guys did as an orchestra.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I could make some people kind of give me a dirty look for saying this, but St. Luke's was sort of, you know, had a quasi sort of hippie-ish kind of vibe about it, and Orpheus was more driven, you know, really intense and fantastic. So, and then you had a few people like me that sort of floated between the groups, and yeah, St. Luke's, we did, you know, the Nixon in China project with John Adams, which was real groundbreaking. And we did dance projects with Pina Bausch and Mark Morris. We were really involved at the Brooklyn Academy a lot. Then the orchestra got a series at Carnegie and became sort of the gun for hire orchestra at Carnegie, backing up all sorts of people that would come through Carnegie. And Orpheus, much more of a touring and you know, much more of an identity as a repertory chamber orchestra, and fascinating. I mean, some of the most memorable musical experiences in those two groups, different but both, you know, unique, and you know, doing you know, Schoenberg and Stravinsky with Orpheus, but then again with St. Luke's, we did 8 or 9 CDs with Robert Kraft of Stravinsky. So, you know, that was a real amazing time to go through. Yeah,
good stuff. Well, I mentioned in the intro that, you know, you are, if not the most recorded trumpet player, certainly in the top several most recorded trumpet players in the chamber music medium, and you've already obviously just touched on a couple. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about some of the other projects. I know you were involved in an award-winning Brandenburg Concerto recording. Several of those Bach pieces you're known for, the B minor Mass, Christmas Oratory. I also know the Copland's Quiet City. You're playing on that has gotten rave reviews from critics, and maybe you could, if you would, just, I know there's so many to go through in your career, but if there are some other moments outside of those orchestras that you just talked about that kind of jump out at you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I that Copeland, that was the first. I had done LPs in the '70s. I did a bunch of brass quintet recordings for Alec Wilder, long before I came to New York. And but the first time I sort of recorded commercially as a soloist was the Copeland Quiet City. We did a whole Copeland record with Dennis Russell Davies and St. Luke's, music for the theater and music for movies. I was sitting in a coffee shop with a drummer, Franklin Kiermaier, who's a dear friend of mine, and Franklin later we recorded with Pharoah Sanders. Franklin's sort of a post Elvin Jones, but I don't want to label him because Franklin is his own universe. Just look him up online. He lives in Scandinavia now, and but he just did a recording with Junie Booth, and then just an amazing guy. But we're talking about a project, and then we're in a coffee shop, and I hear Quiet City on a speaker, and then we go back to, and then later they announce my name. I didn't know the record had been out. Yeah, sort of funny. But I was very grateful for that, the chance to do the Brandenburg. I performed the Brandenburg many times. I think I stopped counting at around 80 or so, but I still got to do it this winter, which I'm getting a little long in the tooth for, but I got talked into it. But and I've done it many times overseas. I once did it in Osaka, where this was in the late 80s, and the Japanese had this like RoboCam on stage, and while I'm playing it, this like robotic camera is circling me. And in fact, Joe Alessi told me once that he was in Japan and saw it on TV once. It's kind of like the Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, the 360 thing. I've never seen it. I just heard about it.
That's something that needs to be on YouTube immediately.
I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, we recorded it up at the American Academy's Letters on 155th, and I was in D.C. at that time, but St. Luke's asked me to come up and do it, and I was very, we did it all under the same mics. It's all balanced, so to speak, live. Brandenburg is a piece that it's very tempting to isolate the trumpeter because there's a lot. It's hard to balance in that high register with the flute, the oboe, and the violin. Mm-hmm. And but we all did it all live, and even the piano, the string orchestra is like 2 on a part, so it's very transparent. But it came like Liz Ostro, great producer, who used to produce all of New World Records. She was there, and she was sort of my booth buddy for that, and she helped me. Actually, I give her a lot of credit for the success of that recording. But to play with Steve Taylor and Liz Mann, Krista Benyon, these musicians are just amazing. Have always been. There was another group in New York called the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra, sort of put together for some recordings. I did a lot of things with them. Havana CD, which with Prayer of St. Gregory, and the Concerto for Trumpet and Band, and the Aria for Trumpet and Strings, and that won a Billboard magazine Best Recording of the Year back in '93 or '94, and sold a lot of copies. You can't really say that expression anymore. Records don't really say. They get downloaded a lot, I guess.
Yeah.
We had a lot of likes, I guess I should say. Anyway, yeah, it was great. I did get a chance to record the Stravinsky Octet 3 times, and one of them won a Grammy, and L'Histoire a couple times. I also feel strongly that I just happen to be in the right place at the right time. So I feel very grateful. Good luck is, an old teacher used to tell me this, and this is an old saying, good luck is when preparation and opportunity intersect, and I happen to be lucky in the fact that, I was in New York in a decade when all this recording activity was going on, and so I'll never take that for granted. I've just been given that opportunity. Well,
you're a very humble guy, but I think if you're in the right place in the right time for the last 40 years, every day, it's a little more than just that. But it's a great quality that makes you part of the success that you've had, I think, too. Maybe we could shift gears now a little bit, Chris, and talk about orchestral playing. In addition to your time in Kansas City, I know you've been guest principal trumpet with the New York Philharmonic, San Francisco Symphony, and I know orchestras around the country and probably around the world have tried to get your services many, many times, and because of your schedules, you're not always able to do it. But in addition to talking about any of those orchestras that you like, I'd also like to hear your perspective on how you approach playing in the orchestra as opposed to playing in a chamber situation. And maybe it's not a huge difference. Maybe it's more organic to you. But I'm just curious about that.
It is. No, it's a great question, and it's a big topic. It's like a singer doing opera versus singing a Schubert lead, recital. So chamber music is, and I learned this from Armando Gattal years ago. He said, chamber music is conversational. You play like you're speaking. In the orchestra, you're more like addressing a big crowd. So if you were doing the Gettysburg Address, you're going to speak a certain way, and you wouldn't speak like that to someone right next to you, or if you did, you'd be carted off. And likewise, if you speak conversationally to a big crowd, you won't get heard. So and it's something that needs to be practiced and cultivated, that art of expression and projection. And it's not just volume, but also stylistically. Like in the orchestra, you bring out little details, maybe proportionally more, like you'll articulate a little harder quick notes to get them out front. And there are trumpet players who will do that same thing when they're playing a sonata for trumpet and piano, and it's totally a bad decision in my opinion in that case, because you want to play conversationally. You don't need to project, but it's so ingrained in the habits of trumpet players, because we're basically brought up, that's the starting point. How do you project and play sort of big? So that's that idea. And then tonal quality. I was a student when the Berlin Philharmonic came to New York, and that just turned a lot of people. That was in the early 70s and that's when conductors like Bernstein, Zubin Mehta, James Levine started asking for rotary trumpets. And it wasn't so much that you changed a rotary, but sort of, I think, a darker kind of quality was starting to be prized. I think there was a brighter sort of ethos, before that, in general. I mean, my father used to say, whenever you make a generalization, you leave a lot of the truth out. So I am leaving a lot of the truth out, but you're also putting a little bit of it in, too. And so I've always tried to play sort of more in that dark kind of, I tend to play more B-flat trumpet in the orchestra than most people, and I use rotary if we're all using them. We used a lot of them in New York with St. Luke's and even Orpheus, and so those kind of things. But it's a great topic, and just listening a lot. When I was a student, you could drop the needle and you could say that's Philly, that's Cleveland, that's Boston, that's Chicago, that's New York. Orchestras sound much more similar nowadays than they used to, and we were talking earlier about students nowadays don't really buy recordings; they download, and often I find with my students who are great, and I learn a tremendous amount from them very often, but often the act of downloading, I'll say, well, who's on that? And so when you bought a record, you saw that it was Fritz Reiner in Chicago. You download something, you might forget who it is, and so we identified styles more distinctly in that fashion, which was easier to do. But orchestras sound a lot more similar now than they used to. I think there's that book, The World is Flat, applies to the general standard is, as people like some of the classic trumpet players have said, like Tom Stevens, that the general standard is up.
Right.
But it's also, there's a leveling also.
Yeah.
Of stylistic.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I remember hearing the New York Philharmonic and Cleveland Orchestra back when a good friend of mine, Steve Witzer, was alive and playing in the Cleveland Orchestra, and then I had gone to hear an all Copeland concert with Bernstein conducting with New York Phil, and then the next night I heard Cleveland playing. And you're right. I mean, hearing the distinctly different styles, and I think now some of that's getting, the corners are getting rounded a bit, But Chris, I wanted to talk yet another facet of your playing, and I think I just wanted to address one thing you just said when you talked about listening. And I know the times we've worked together, I just immediately sense that from you, is that you're always listening to everybody in whatever situation you're in. So I think that's probably a really important point that you brought up, is that it's important to adapt to whatever, and the only way that's going to happen is through listening. And extending that one step further, let's talk a little bit about your solo playing, which is equally extraordinary. And I wanted to specifically focus on your relationship with Eric Ewazen, who I consider to be one of the great brass composers of all time, certainly in the current composers. And he's written the beautiful piece Sonata for Trumpet and Piano, which I believe he wrote for you and you recorded. And I wondered if you could talk about how you approach solo playing, and then also if you, at the same time, maybe address your relationship with Eric a bit.
Well, let me start with Eric, because we went to school together. And at Eastman, that's another, I was very interested in composing. And I wanted to be, I can't. I mean, it takes perseverance and hard work like anything. I have perseverance and hard work when it comes to the trumpet. I didn't have. I could always come up with a clever opening. I couldn't see it through. And I remember Sam Adler, who was teaching composition, he chuckled with me. He used to have an exercise where you would, he wanted his students to write 40 measures a day, just to get used to that sort of industry. And I remember he said to me, and I wasn't really seriously studying, but he chuckled at me one day and said, "I've noticed you write a lot in 2/4." So I was trying to get my 40 in. So it wasn't in the cards for me, but I live vicariously through composing. And Eric is one of them. I played on every composers forum at Eastman, and I continue. I've always got projects with composers going on. Right now, I'm in the middle of them too. I just spoke to a friend of mine in North Carolina who's writing. I've always got stuff in the pipeline, and I'm very anxious to, make contact with composers in that way. And like I say, it's probably that I'm living vicariously through them in a way. Eric and I are dear friends. He was at Eastman, and we were in the same class. Anyway, he came to New York right after, and he was teaching at Juilliard, just theory and also in the prep department. And I remember it was 85 or 86. Barrio had written the sequenza for solo trumpet and for Tom Stevens, who premiered in LA, but I was asked to do the New York premiere. And I did it, and Eric came to the concert, I remember, and we went out for a drink afterwards. There was a little group of us, and started talking to Eric, and I said, you should write some brass stuff, and write, and I encouraged him to write a brass quintet. And the next year, he came out with the Colchester Fantasy, which became a real signature piece for the American Brass Quintet. And then, but anyway, then he was in the mid-'90s writing Sonata, and I was living not that far from him in those days. And every 50, 60 measures, so I would come over, and it's a great piece. It's now, according to some records kept by ASCAP and the International Trumpet Guild, I believe it's the most performed trumpet sonata. It's a terrific
wonderful
piece.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah.
And Eric is often typified as a sort of a neo-romantic or and he does write tonally. By the way, he was a student of Milton Babbitt's, and they're very close. And I knew Milton too, and Milton was an amazing teacher, and of course, we know his music. I mean, but he was an amazing teacher who wanted his students to write. And I'll name another student of Milton Babbitt, was Stephen Sondheim. So, Milton taught people to find their own identity.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Eric, I think he writes actually quite revolutionary for the trumpet in that he writes the trumpet, like there are parts in the sonata where the trumpet is accompanying the piano. And I've heard the sonata played by some really great players who, the traditional is that trumpet always leads and never follows. Eric actually asks you to play in an ultra conversational way. In the second movement, you state the melody, and then you sort of curve your notes underneath the piano. So it's like you're playing viola or something, and complementing what the pianist is doing. So Eric is writing quite new, in a new way for the trumpet, and he's asking and sort of demanding that the trumpet be thought of differently. And there are sort of an old school of trumpet. You don't, you're always at the head of the parade. And Eric is asking for this sort of like snake charmer, inside kind of thing, which is really exciting, I think. And so there's been a bunch of other pieces too. I mean, Song Cycle, a trio with violin, another trio with cello. I mean, he's really written some great stuff.
Yeah,
the
extremely
trumpet,
prolific, and it does seem like you and him are a match made in musical heaven there, because you're that kind of player, that you have the instincts to follow what the music is giving you.
Well, I'm grateful for him. I mean, I don't ever say to him, write this way, write that way. I might make a suggestion, like mostly, I need some rest here, but he, I'm just very, grateful. And by the way, I don't think of it as that he wrote for me. Like the trio for violin, trumpet, and piano, he wrote for me, and I premiered it and everything. And then, but I don't. To me, it's written for all of us, and who cares who plays a piece first? And so when the opportunity for Phil Smith to record it came up, and Phil called me and said, it's like, of course. I mean, I recorded it later, and I'm very happy with the recording I was able to do. But this idea that a performer has sort of ownership of a piece, I just have no patience for that. I mean, it's just, once they write something, it just belongs to all of us.
That's a great outlook, yeah. Well, let's switch gears even one more time here and talk about your versatility. I know you and I have worked together a lot on various motion picture soundtracks. We did some concerts with Sting together, and I think we did David Letterman with Peter Gabriel together. And it just seems like whatever situation you find yourself in, you were able to shine musically and really bring something to the table. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the recording you did with Wayne Shorter, which I think is an astounding piece of your resume. It's just incredible that you've done all these different things. But anyway, really specifically, it's talking about how you approach that part of the playing, which you seem to be very comfortable in that world as well, which is not always the case for more classically oriented players. But just kind of curious about how you approach the versatility aspect.
Well, first of all, there's a place everyone is going to be uncomfortable, and no one can do everything. I think that it just comes from inside. And I grew up with rock and roll and jazz, and by the way, those are not necessarily compatible. I know jazz musicians who cannot play a rock thing.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And of course, a lot of rock musicians are mystified by the complexities that are inherent in jazz, and there might be a jazz musician who is very uncomfortable with Latin music, or have a tough time in a Broadway show. It's just like
sure.
The first time I subbed on a Broadway show when I first got to New York, I was sitting next to somebody who I grew up listening to, who had played with Charles Mingus. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I'm sitting here. And so I'm reading this show, and at 15 minutes of the show, I feel a tap on my shoulder, and I'm like, I look over at him, and he goes, "Where are we?" So, I mean, he was great, everything, but that was, anyway, I'll get a lot of people come to me for lessons, and they'll sort of say, I'd like to learn a little about jazz, and the idea is that I'm going to add it to my skill set. And I'm very respectful. I mean, I appreciate that sort of thing, but it's not really going to happen that way. It's really got to come from inside. There's a big difference between playing jazzy and jazz. So, you hear Gershwin, American in Paris, and that trumpet solo. And I've heard some really great orchestral players play that. And I don't mean any disrespect, but I'm almost nauseated because they're doing so much inflection. It's like hearing a British guy trying to sound so black, that black player going, God damn, it's like that. And it's, so, when you hear the Ellington Orchestra, and my father had some of those records, and you listen to Ray Nance and Johnny Hodges and Sam Nanton, there's a certain dignity to the solos. Now, there is earthy expression, but there's a sort of, and when you hear Wayne Shorter, John Coltrane, there's a dignity. It's not like, jazzy. That's something else. So I think it's. You'll play in a brass quintet now and then. You'll do an arrangement of something. I remember Alan Dean and I talking about that, and this is kind of embarrassing to it's just tough. And so anyway, it has to come from inside, including a feeling for rock, and which is a different kind of beat. And when I was in Europe with Sting, and we're doing a lot of filming and live recordings over there, and some of his musicians would I was Ira Coleman was on bass, and we had a few. And they would always chuckle about the Yank musicians that we sort of felt the beat sort of in back of the beat, and that, you know, they were right on top. You know, it's a different thing, and I think it's true. I mean, listening, but listening means sort of listening to what's underneath and wanting to be coming, you know, the core of it, and it comes from, like, you know, I worked off and on with Sting in various different things from the 80s, because I played that show on Broadway. He did the Three Penny Opera, and later on was doing, you know, he had concerts where he would want to do Penny Lane, and I would play the piccolo trumpet, you know, and then this project, which was sort of folk kind of music, and there's another thing. I arrive in Durham, England, and there's basically not really any music, you know. And then you go back to your early experiences of playing with bands where you did sort of, you know, and it's kind of like, you know, find a way to contribute. And so I don't, you know, versatility is a funny word. I understand what it means. But I think there's an internal side to it. It's not external. You can't put on a suit on, here's my jazz suit, here's my rock suit. Yeah, it's got to come from deep inside, I think.
That's really well said. I think that's exactly what it is, and it does have to be internal, and it is interesting to see certain, you know, you bring up jazz musicians playing rock. I mean, that's always a striking thing to me, that sometimes that just doesn't happen.
The 70s were really bad for that, because there were some jazz musicians who thought they could make more money, and there's some real stinkers.
Yeah, indeed.
Of great musicians, but it's just, you know, someone was telling me once, someone was recording down in the Virgin Islands, and they had this great drummer, and it just wasn't working, and they found that Ringo Starr was on the beach getting a suntan, and they called him in, and you know, Ringo didn't have any of the technique, but it was just perfect, you know, it's just the feel, you know, it's these intangibles.
Yeah, indeed. Well, this interview has felt like a lesson in a way. You've got it said so many great things and so many helpful things, but let's take a second and talk about your role as an educator. You're highly esteemed teacher. People come around the world to study with you. You have been at the University of Maryland since 1998, but previous to that, you taught at Juilliard and Columbia, Manhattan School of Music. We were talking about some of your students, and so many of them have gone on to great success, but among your standouts, Michael Lenhart, who plays with Steely Dan, among other things, one of the great musicians, young trumpet players, amazing writer as well. And of course, David Krause, who's the principal trumpeter of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. But clearly you've had equal amount of success as a trumpet professor. Maybe you could talk about some of the experiences you've had in that realm and your feelings about education.
Well, it's, I think some ancient thinker said, to teach is to learn twice, and I feel like I learn a lot from teaching, so I'm grateful for that. And but what I'm trying, I think any teacher you study with is going to teach you what it is got them over. My generation, the older players, it was transposition. Like, we got hammered with it. I'm more likely to focus on rhythmic literacy, and I place a big priority on laying the groundwork for someone to sight read well. In other words, to sit down at a job and be able to play whatever is put in front of them. Because, as you know better than me, that in the studio, that's what you do. The ink is often not even dry. You're expected. And there's no learning curve. It's not like, let's work on this till we get it right. It's like,
yeah.
If it's, anyway, so, but it's a commitment, and I have a lot of approaches. Another thing, kids my age, when I was young, we all went to Bruce Lee movies, and I always remember thinking Bruce Lee, because we all had his books too, and he always said that a teacher is a finger pointing at the moon, and a good student looks at the moon, a bad student looks at the finger. So that's all we're doing. To me, great trumpet playing or great musician is something bigger. Musicianship is something bigger than us. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than the student. It's something out there, and I'm pointing to it, and I'm asking the student to aim for that. And that's an attitude actually Arnold Jacobs talked a lot about. When I was in Kansas City in the mid-'70s, my best friend, my roommate at Eastman, was a horn player named Ron Schneider. We're still very dear friends. He's just retiring his third horn at Pittsburgh Symphony. He took Phil Myers' place. Phil Myers left third horn Pittsburgh to come to first in New York. And Ron went to Northwestern as a graduate student, and I was in Kansas. And every time I had any time off, I would take a train from Kansas to Chicago. In the mid-'70s, Chicago was such a mecca for brass. I'd go to master classes and just sit, watch, Jacobs, Clevenger, Jay Friedman, unbelievable time. But I remember Jacobs saying, don't be obsessed with your sound. And we're like, what? He said, be obsessed with what you want to sound like. Now, always project your... he said people will play and they'll be criticizing themselves. You sound different on different days, but if you're always playing to this ideal, you will sound the best on that given day. And he said he learned that from Herseth. Herseth would not be that concerned about... Herseth would be playing toward an ideal all the time. And if you always play toward an ideal, if you always play toward great musicianship, and don't be concerned, everyone makes mistakes, everyone screws, everyone sounds bad at times, but you're always playing toward an ideal. You'll always play your best at any given moment. And so I don't like to hear people say, well, I'm going to practice, and then, I'm going to play until I like the way I sound. I mean, I understand that. I mean, actually, we all do that too. But that the whole Jacobs thing was about projection, about playing beyond yourself. And I think that's ultimately the secret to being happy as a musician. I mean, it's a tough world. It's a tough, exasperating, difficult way. It's weird to be a performer, especially you get older. I mean, it's weird to go on stage, bright lights, you're dressed up, but you love it, or you need it, rather. And you have to have two attitudes. You have to be your own worst critic, and you also have to enjoy what you do. You have to believe that you have the right to enjoy what you do. If you do nothing but criticize yourself, you're a neurotic mess. And if you just do nothing but like what you do, that's no good either. You never get any better. So the two things have to be sort of this continual yin-yang kind of circle. You're hard on yourself, but you also have to sort of have this love of pointing towards something that's bigger than you. And that's what Jacob said. And that's sort of what you're teaching the students to project themselves. And there's a lot of grunt work, working this out, working that out. But yeah, it's a combination of short-term and long-term goals, I guess. Yeah.
Wow, that is an incredibly well said. I mean, I love the analogy of the moon, and it's just so well said. Chris, let's, if we can, talk a little bit about kind of the state of classical music, the state of chamber music. I know a lot of our colleagues in New York and string players that I work with talk about how much the business has contracted for them. The more freelance orchestras are getting less and less. Even if they're still in existence, their seasons are much less. We're seeing problems with orchestras, but yet we're starting to see a little bit of brightness on the horizon. I'm seeing orchestras that are doing well. I just read an article about Chicago Symphony's had their 4th year in a row of record-breaking ticket sales. So I was curious from your perspective, because I think your vantage point is quite unique in that you've been in all of these worlds and had such success in all these different mediums. How do you see the future, especially as an educator, and you're sending out all these wonderful students who are having success, but how do you see the future of classical music in general, but widening that out a little bit, just that type of music, and how is it going to survive and prosper in the future?
Oh, great question. And just as a brief prelude, I often like to talk. Sometimes I talk to the students about what classical means, and technically classical means not subject to fad. And I will remind them that nothing is more classical than Duke Ellington and Miles Davis.
Right, yeah.
So, and Beatles, of course, things that have stood the test of time. So to speak. Well, and I'm going back to I usually bring up sayings that my father died when I was pretty young, so I remember a lot of what he said. And he used to tell me, he said, don't let anyone tell you there was ever any good old days. No matter what period of time you live in, it's a mixture of good and bad. We tend as humans, our psychology tends to look in the past sort of rosily. I remember Johnny Ware in the New York Philharmonic telling me, the best time to be in the Philharmonic was in the 50s, the way the balance, it was a 30 some weeks, you'll just hear of a wide variety of things. the very first opera ever composed, Monteverdi, in I think 1607 in Venice. Within 20 years, there were letters of protest to the city government that this art form, it cannot sustain itself. It's too expensive. It's a waste of money. You know, scientists look at bumblebees and say they cannot. According to the laws of aerodynamics, they're not supposed to be able to fly, yet they fly. I think the music business is like the bumblebee. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense, yet it's never going to go away.
Yeah.
So it's always, you know, when the first sound, you can look at back old Union papers. When the first sound movies came out, there was a tremendous fear that the music business was done for because all these theaters that had orchestras no longer. When Chariots of Fire came out in the early 70s, it was the first synthesized soundtrack. Oh, it's all over. Forget it. We're all done for.
Yeah.
In that time, there was a time when synthesizer players were paid something like 37 times scale. It just lasted like a couple of years because the union was so afraid of them replacing string sections. Now we have the virtual orchestra, which to a lot of theater orchestras is like the dinosaurs looking at the meteor coming to Earth, you know. But we're always going to be in the brink of disaster. That's just the way the business is, and I just believe it'll always sort of find a way because music is part of being human. And I know that sounds a little, you know, kind of like maybe rosy, but it's actually the damn truth. You know, it's like orchestras have had tremendous troubles, and there's a cyclical nature to this. Also with students, you know, you get to be older, when I would go in to play with the Philharmonic, you know, we talked to Carmine and some of the players, and they would really not have a strong sense of any music making in New York City outside of Lincoln Center. You'll get older players saying, well, there's nothing for young players to do anymore. Well, I'm in contact with young players, and some of them are really busy. Now, I'm not saying that they're doing, you know, they may be doing something that hopefully will pay more in the future, but there's a lot of activity. It's almost like in the forest, you know, a predator may not be aware of another you know. So when you get older as a musician, you're sort of playing with people that are in your group, and you're not aware of like two rungs down, but there's a tremendous amount of activity going on. And, you know, there has to be, because we're flooded with applicants, and a lot of music schools are. If there was this desert out there, that wouldn't be. It just wouldn't be. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that it's the best decision to make in all cases, but you know, there was, and there always will be a lot of musical activity. Now, the ins and outs of the music business and how different industries work, they'll have their fluctuations. The theater, orchestras, yeah, it is very serious. I played Peter Pan a couple of years ago and at Wolf Trap down in D.C., and half the pit was two people on computer, you know.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, what? We didn't know that, you know. Suddenly, all the string players we knew, they weren't there, you know. And so it's always going to be problematical. The future will probably be a lot like now, and probably if you really went back 30 years, similar. I mean, I remember people in the 70s talking about, oh, it's, you know, New York is like, and then the 80s had a reburgeoning, you know, I don't know. So it's not I don't really have a good answer. I can't tell you what the future, probably the future will be a lot like now and probably a lot like the past with different details.
I think it's really well said, though. I mean, you brought up a lot of great points, and I think it's a challenging business, always has been and always will be, but like you said, I think it will always survive, and in some ways it'll always thrive. You know? And
that goes, you know, listening to the little bit of contact I have just listening to someone like Arnold Jacobs speak, I mean, he always had the thing about you're part of something bigger than yourself, and that's a great perspective is everything. You know, if you get so wrapped up in your own troubles, we all have troubles, but, you know, if you can see what you're doing as part of, you know, that's a kind of a perspective and a way out of you know, getting by.
Yeah, well said. Well, Chris, first of all, thank you again for taking the time today. I know you got a busy schedule and you're heading back to Maryland tonight to hear your daughter play. And but as we wrap up today, I kind of like to give something to younger folks, and I know obviously you're very generous with your time and your thoughts. if you had one piece of advice that you would give to a young musician, doesn't have to be a trumpet player, but anybody, but what would both of your kids are both very talented musicians. I'm sure you give them a lot of guidance in that regard, but I'd be curious to how you would maybe guide a young person who's thinking about becoming a musician.
Well, follow your. I was thinking I was going to say follow your heart, but that sounds too much like a Sound of Music or something. But I remember I was talking to Chris Bodie once, and he was saying that when a young musician says to him, "I listen to everything," Chris said, "Well, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should, of course you listen to everything, but don't be afraid to really get into something. I still do that. And I talk about my friend Bob Sadin, who is a dear friend, and I think the world of him. And he's this monster producer, Grammy winning, all this with all these different. And he and I mostly talk about sport. But some time ago, he sent me this Schoenberg song, Herzgewalt, the Foliage of the Heart. It's the opus right before Perrault. 3.5 minutes. I couldn't get it out of my. So I started listening more Schoenberg. I've recorded Schoenberg in the past, but I never really listened. So lately, that's what I've been doing: violin concerto, variation story, and hearing stuff that I did. So I would say it's not just advice for young, because I'm still doing that. I mean, we're all students our whole life, and follow things and see them through and see where it leads you. That would be my advice. But to be honest, to someone who just does that, they don't need that advice.
Well, listen, Chris, thank you again. It was I enjoyed every minute of it. I felt like you had so many great things to say, and I know all of our listeners are going to get a ton out of it. Keep an eye on this young man. He's always doing something cool and creative, and if you're down at Maryland, they've got an amazing program down there, and check out what they're up to. But Chris, once again, thanks so much.
Thanks.
We will see all of you next time on Bone2Pick.